Good morning. Good to see you all again. Um, yeah, so, well, thank you. Last week, Pastor John called me up and asked me if I would preach this week on Ephesians. And I remember, I think you start Ephesians back in October. So he said, Blaine, you need to help me find my way out of Ephesians. Because I think John's got lost in the book of Ephesians, right? So anyways, I'll sort of pick things up where Pastor John left off. So what we're going to look at today are the first 5 verses of chapter 5. But keep this title in mind, Living as Beloved Children, okay, with the emphasis on ones who are loved, because that becomes very crucial to what we're going to be talking about. But let's look through this passage. As I usually do, I make my own translation because sometimes I find other translations just don't sort of nuance it the way I would want, or I feel what Paul would want the passage to be nuanced. I'll point out later some of the differences, some of the changes I made here to typical translations. But anyways, and note that there are certain phrases that are in bold type. So we're in a section of Ephesians where Paul's moving into more the exhortation, okay? So Paul, a lot of his letters, there's strong focus on theology because he wants Christians to understand what God has done, particularly what God has done through Christ. So he really wants Christians to understand that. But then what you'll find in every one of Paul's letters, he will then move to, okay, so how should we now live? In the light of what God has done for us, what is our response? What should be our response to that? Okay. And so he will give these imperatives or these commands. And so what I put in bold there are sort of the phrases where you find commands or imperatives or exhortations, how we should live now in the light of all that God has done for us. So there's 4 really in this passage, and we'll kind of break down the passage around these 4 commands or imperatives. But therefore, and you know that whenever you see therefore in Paul, that's usually a connector, right? In the light of all of these things, therefore live like this, or this is how you should conduct your lives. So be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love, just as Christ also loved us and gave himself for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. But as for fornication, along with all forms of impurity or greed, let these things not be named among you, as is appropriate to holy people. Also unbefitting is obscene, foolish, or vulgar talk. Rather, encourage thanksgiving. Know this, that no immoral or impure person or one who is greedy, that is, an idolater, has an inheritance in the kingdom of God and of Christ. Okay, so that's the passage we'll focus on here. Two quotes that we'll use to kind of ground what we're talking about here. The first isn't really a quote, but it might as well be a quote, because if you looked at pretty well any book that's written on moral exhortation in Paul, or Paul's ethics, or Paul's moral teaching, you'll find something like this. Okay, so you see this all over the place among New Testament theologians that talk about Paul's moral teaching. And it basically goes like this. For Paul, Christian theology is centered on grace. So it's all, what's the center of Paul's thinking? How God has gifted us. What God has given us in Christ. That's really what grace is, okay? And Christian behavior, again, our response is centered on gratitude. And of course, those words are related. You think of the Latin term gratis, meaning free. You're related to like a gift, but also gratitude's the root of gratitude. So think of grace Grace and gratitude are kind of reflective terms. It originates with God's grace. God gifts us, as Paul would say in Romans, while we were yet sinners. In other words, when we were totally helpless and unable to do anything for ourselves, God sent his son. God gave his son to us. So at the very center of Christian theology is this idea of gift. And all God expects in return is what? Gratitude. A life that reflects that gifting of God, and which then creates in us what? A desire to give back in the ways that God would want us to be give. So what defines the character of God is love and gifting. God wants that to form in our lives, so that our lives are defined by love and gifting. Okay. St. Augustine, who again, very much a student of Paul, one of my favorite statements of his, this is out of his famous book, The Confessions. This is a prayer that he issues in that famous book of his. So he's praying to God and he says, give what you command and command what you will. Because Augustine recognizes, as Paul does, that we are unable to keep the commands of God, right? Paul's very clear on that. In our own power, our own will, we just don't have it within us to be obedient, to fulfill the commands of God. But what does Augustine recognize? That God gifts us. He puts within us that ability to live the kind of life that God calls us to, right? And then if we have that confidence that God's never going to ask of me anything that he doesn't empower or gift me to do, he can go on and keep asking, because that grace is just going to keep flowing into me, shaping and forming me into that kind of person that God wants us to be. Okay, so let's look at this in more detail then. So that, again, that first imperative is be imitators of God. As Paul says, therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children. Let's talk a little bit about imitation in Paul's theology. One thing that's interesting, oftentimes I'll teach classes on discipleship in the New Testament. One thing that's very interesting about Paul is Paul doesn't use the language of discipleship. So that term disciple, for example, which we're so familiar with, especially in the Gospels and Acts, you don't find that in Paul. And even the main verb, what is a disciple? A disciple is basically a learner, a student, that kind of a thing. And the verb that oftentimes is used in the Gospels, that again is the main verb that goes with discipleship, is to follow. And Paul will sometimes use that verb, but he doesn't really use it so much in discipleship context, right? So Paul, what's interesting about Paul then, is he doesn't talk about, it's not that he's not interested in discipleship, but he just doesn't use that language that we're so familiar with from the Gospels and from the book of Acts and that kind of thing. What he prefers is the language of imitation. So imitation becomes a replacement or a substitute term, you could say, for discipleship language in Paul. Okay. Now, why does he do this? In part, because that language of mimesis, which imitation sort of comes from that word. Think of mimic something, right? That Greek concept of mimesis was very well entrenched in the Greek philosophical traditions. You have these big debate between Plato and Aristotle about whether imitation is good or bad, right? But Paul recognizes that in Greek education, imitation is crucial. And that's really what discipleship is about. It's formation, which is what education means. Education is all about forming. And so Jesus is forming disciples as they follow him, as they listen to him, as they see how he conducts himself. They're getting an education in the ways of Jesus, right? And so Paul, that's what Paul's doing to the people he brings to Christ. But he uses this terminology that would be more familiar in a Greek context as far as its language of imitation. So he will often, if you look at Paul's letters, oftentimes he will say to, sounds pretty audacious for us, but he'll say to his churches, imitate me. I mean, think of the responsibility he's putting on his own shoulders, right? Those of us in Christian leadership, we should be so brave as to say, because I think most of us would say, wait a minute, do I really want to say to people, imitate me? Because I know yesterday there's certain things I said and did that I wouldn't necessarily want them to imitate, when I lost my temper, when such and, right? So we oftentimes don't have that audacity that Paul has. But Paul recognizes if you're going to take a leadership role in the church, you need to be willing to say that. Because people need to see the character of God fleshed out, right? And of course, Paul will not just say imitate me, but he'll also look at some of his close associates. These are people worthy of imitation. He will sometimes point out other churches. This is a church that you guys can learn a lot from. Imitate them. Because he recognizes that it is good for the whole ethos of the Christian faith to be enfleshed. That's really what the incarnation is about. How would we know what God is really about if it hadn't been for Jesus becoming human and living among us, right? And Paul says that inasmuch as the Spirit of Christ dwells within us, we need to become the kind of people that others can imitate. Okay, so he'll use that language of imitation because it kind of stands in for discipleship language for Paul. But another reason why he uses imitation language is it very much relates to the concept of the image of God. And that's an area of theology that Paul very much develops. He realizes, going back to Genesis 1, as humans, what were we created to do or to be? To image God, to be imitators of God, to reflect, to be representations of God. That's ideally what every human is created for and intended to do, is to reflect or represent. What does an image do? It represents the deity or the God. And so we are created to be images of God. And Paul recognized that this language of imitation very much ties into that language of imaging God that he's so interested in developing because that's ultimately the path of discipleship. If you wanted to define that in Paul's language, what is, it doesn't use discipleship language, but if you're going to ask you to recognize that language, what's the goal of this? That the image of Christ would be formed in you. And Christ being the perfect image of God, as we model ourselves after Christ and we imitate Christ, we become what we were created to be. But note that language, there's be imitators of God as beloved children. If we don't feel loved, again, God can give us a gift, but if we don't receive that gift, if we don't embrace that gift, if we don't fully own that giftedness of God's love, we're never going to be able to act as the people of God. We're never going to be able to image or imitate God. We have to experience his love, okay? And that, we'll come back to that in just a moment, but because the second point ties in with that. Here's where I made kind of one change in translation. A lot of translations will have live in love or live according to love, that kind of a thing. But the language that Paul used, the verb that he uses here is peripateo, which is to walk, right? So it's very much in that Hebraic Jewish idea that life is a walk. And we'll even use that metaphor, okay? Life being a walk. And why that's important is because a walk suggests what? Movement, right? Development, progress. So walk has those ideas. You can sometimes live your life in such a way where it's just a vicious cycle. And a lot of people, that is their life, right? It's just, they'd be living for the weekend. So it's it's like the tedious 5 days of work and then kind of blow out on the weekend, right? I mean, so they end up in this cyclical kind of rut. Their life isn't really moving anywhere. So this language of walk is important because it suggests movement, okay, and it suggests direction, like you're moving in a particular direction. And of course, think so often in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy, in the Proverbs and Psalms, where there's different paths you can choose in life, right? Not every walk leads to, and this brings us to the third point, a destination or a goal. So the nice thing about a walk, so, we tend to walk for exercise, where you might just walk in a circle. In the ancient world, people got enough exercise. When you're walking, it's with a goal in mind, okay? You're walking to a particular destination. You're not walking just to take off a pound or two. You're walking with a purpose. So, this is what Paul's saying, and that's why he uses this language of walk, okay? Your life should have a goal, your life should have purpose, your life should have direction, you should see progress in your life, there should be movement there, all of these kinds of things. But what's the sphere in which all of this has to take place? It's love, okay? Because if that doesn't define how we are moving through this life, we've missed the point of what the Christian life is all about. Love has to be the sphere in which we move and live. And of course, the example Paul gives here is Christ. Okay, because again, how can we imitate God? Paul always says by looking at Christ. What motivated Christ? How did Christ move in the world? It was defined by love. Everything Jesus does in the course of his ministry, think of that language of mercy and compassion. He'll see a blind person, he'll see a crippled person, he'll see a widowed mother whose son has just died, and he's moved with compassion. That's what so often is motivating Jesus, is this love. He sees so many needs around him, and it always elicits a response of love from him. But that love culminates, of course, on the cross, okay? And what's interesting here is there's so many ways in which, we could define the cross. But look at the language that Paul uses here. It's a fragrant offering. It's something of beauty. So even though it's this horrible death, what Paul's inviting us to do is look at Jesus on the cross as something very beautiful, because this is what God's love looks like. That Jesus, the Son of God, would be willing to pay this ultimate sacrifice, die in this horrible manner and this shameful manner. That shows us the depth of God's love for us, right? And that's why we need to appropriate this. Mentioned before how how Paul will give theology, but then he'll also bring out the practical implications of this. And for Paul, it's so much about love, but I keep coming back to this thing. This is, again, live as beloved children. We need to, something that hit me about, I forget when this would have been, probably 20, 25 years ago, is I realized that what I really had to do was catch a real vision for God's love for me. Because my theology was pretty good. I mean, I understood the theology of the Bible really well. And, but then when you're going through, when life begins, when you're starting to raise children, when life gets more complicated and those kinds of things, I realized that I really need, and one thing I really prayed for, and one thing that was it really kind of helped me too. I remember one time we were in Norwich in England, and you have a famous medieval mystic called Juliana of Norwich. And so she was, like many medieval mystics, she kind of lived like a hermit kind of life. But she just sort of cuts herself off from the world and basically just spends almost her entire life in prayer and reflection and meditation. Not that I don't think Paul would necessarily endorse that kind of life, but some people live those lives, and sometimes we can benefit from people who choose that path. Because she wrote this book as a result of all this called Revelations of Divine Love, where she was just captured by the love of God. And it gave her such a peace and an assurance. And I remember thinking, I could probably use some more of that. Because again, theology, and again, it's not an either or. It's always a both and, right? You want to have your theology in place, but at the same time, your theology is not going to help you live your life in imitation of God if you don't feel beloved, right? And so that became a focus for me for a while, is just, God, help me, and help me not just to, again, on an intellectual level, it's easy to think, yeah, I know Christ died for me. I know all, you can kind of process it intellectually, but that's very different from processing it on this very existential level, where you just feel loved. And I found that once to me, that was kind of an important period of maturity in my spiritual life, because I realized that all of a sudden I just wasn't anxious about stuff anymore. I just felt like, even with my children, with my sons, I just felt I can just kind of take a more relaxed approach to things, and all this kind of stuff, right? And so I think that's one thing I very much want to leave with you today, is that you need to feel loved. Jesus talks about the dual love command. When he's reducing all the commandments of the Old Testament, he reduces it to what? Two things: love God and love your neighbor, right? And I don't want to say Jesus' teaching is deficient at this point, but if I could add a third thing to this, which I think I think it kind of goes without saying: love God, love your neighbor, feel loved. Because if you don't feel loved by God, you're not going to be able to love God properly. And you're not going to be able to love your neighbor, because your neighbor can be a pain in the neck, right? And it becomes very easy to give up loving that neighbor, because he's just, after a while, you just feel it's not worth it. But if you're loved by God, you've got this inexhaustible source of loving that can flow out of you, right? So we really need to capture that vision, like Juliana had, that vision of this revelation of divine love, okay? Which so much takes a burden off our shoulders, because it's no longer down to us. We simply have to rest in God's love for us, be a conduit of that love. We want to be a channel of that love. But in a sense, we're taking ourselves out of the way so that we can become more of a pure channel of God's love. Okay. Okay, the third thing, so he moves on to this topic of fornication, including all other forms of impurity, and greed. These two things that sort of trip people up a lot, okay? But note what he says, when we get into the imperative section: let these things not be named among you, as is appropriate to holy people, also unbefitting is obscene, foolish, vulgar talk. Rather, encourage thanksgiving. But you'll find in a lot of translations, and one thing that kind of bothered me was some of the translations I looked at, they basically translated these things shouldn't even be mentioned among you. But there is a distinction that Paul would want to make, I think, between naming something and mentioning it. If we're in a community, we have to talk about these things, right? Because these are just the common flaws of human nature, right? So people fall into these kinds of things, okay? And we don't want to take this point where you don't even mention these things, because all that leads to is just what? Yeah, secrecy. People aren't going to confess their sins if they're going to feel that they're going to be just ostracized, right? Or that there's just covered with shame, right? So if you don't even mention it, part of the reason why I don't like that translation, don't even mention these things, it seems like a very repressed community, right? Where we don't even talk about these things because let's just hush this all up, right? The language that Paul uses here is don't name these things. And there's a crucial difference here, okay? Because to name something gives it a certain power, right? And so to define us. So basically what he's saying is this kind of behavior does characterize fallen human nature. But this shouldn't define what we are as a community, okay? And we don't want to name these things in a way that would give power to them or normalize them or cause us to reshape our perception or our understanding of these things. So we need to recognize them for what they are, but not give them any power. It's significant that Paul says this in a letter that has so much to say about powers and principalities. Paul realizes that in this world that God's love flows through, you also have what? These powers and principalities, these negative forces, these negative entities, the very things that will think of fornication and greed, taking something that is part of the goodness of God's creation, human sexuality, it's a good thing, right? It's one of these, it's a blessing, it's a positive, it's something that God intended for good. Same thing with, we feel good when we build something. Like I'm thinking of greed. Greed becomes, if fornication is sort of the distortion or the perversion of this good sexual gift that God gave to humanity, another one of God's gift is that ability to what? Produce something, to gain something from what you produce, to work and enjoy the blessings and the benefits of what you produce, right? That's all part of the good, look back in Genesis 1 and 2, God creates the humans to what? Work, right? He wants them to be productive. And he recognizes that with that productivity comes certain things that we then possess and acquire. But greed is what? When those things begin to possess us, right? And so Paul recognizes that what's at the root of fornication and greed is an emptiness, right? There's a void, because when people, and keep in mind in our culture, there's many ways that that these things can, throughout history, these things have crept up, but we see this in our culture. When people feel an emptiness, when people feel the void in the center of their soul, what do they fill it up with usually? Sex and money, right? And then then the sex isn't good enough because it becomes this insatiable kind of thing where there's never enough women or there's never enough money, right? So many people get into that trap, One thing that's become very apparent in recent weeks in our society is this sort of Epstein class, right? These very mainly men, but these very powerful men who are both what? Greedy and sexually perverted, right? And it's not surprising that because those are two very powerful things, because all of us can relate to that, right? I can relate to greed all the time because, it's nice to see your stock portfolio grow, right? And you, but you, at the same time, you have to recognize that I have to put that can't possess me. That is, I have to see it as a gift from God that I need to steward properly and not allow to become too important in my life. Okay. And the same thing with, again, sexual areas. We just need to recognize that those are very strong appetites. You know, the appetite to acquire, the appetite of acquisition is very powerful. And the appetite of sexuality is very powerful. So it's not surprising that Paul uses those two examples, because he recognizes that when people feel an emptiness and a void, that's normally where they turn, in those two directions. One, maybe both directions, but those are the most preeminent directions, right? And that's why we have to be very careful how we do talk about them, right? Because Paul recognizes that there's a power in these things, especially when you think of these demonic principalities and powers. They're going to use money and sexuality all the time to pervert, to take us off that walk that we should be following. Okay, so Paul has a lot to say about, and you'll see this in this surrounding section of Ephesians, a lot to say about proper speech, because again, as Jesus would say, out of the fullness of the heart, the mouth speaks. What you say tells an awful lot about who you are, the kinds of things you want to talk about, okay? And so we really need to, again, we need to talk about these things constructively when they happen. We don't want to sweep these things under the carpet. We do want to face them. But we also want to recognize that there is a power behind these things, and we don't want to name them to the degree that they begin to define us or change us in subtle ways. And this is why, and again, if we don't have that hole in our soul, we're going to be, that's kind of the antidote, you could say. And that's where feeling loved becomes so important. Because if you really feel loved by God, you're not going to, this isn't going to be a risk, okay? Because you already have that which satisfies, that which fills you, okay? Yeah, that language of filling is another very important thing in the Bible, because you can be filled with, it's interesting, one of the first commands given to humans is fill the earth, but then that's just sort of, but think of, talk about filling of the Spirit, but you can also be filled with what? Envy, jealousy, all these other things. So we have to be very careful what fills us. And this is why, beloved, and going back to just making this prayer of, God, I want to know your love on such a profound level that it becomes the antidote to any temptation that might come my way. Okay. And the final thing is, know the outcome of your life's direction. Okay, so we're on this walk, and then Paul says, know this. So this is the fourth imperative in this passage. Know this, that no immoral or impure person or one who is greedy, that is an idolater, has an inheritance in the kingdom of God and of Christ. Okay, we talk a lot at Image Church about eschatology, and again, eschatology just has to do with the end. Okay, we talked about how we're on this walk, and this walk is ultimately leading to a destination. And that destination is sort of what we mean by eschatology. The end point is either going to be with God or apart from God. Okay, you're on a path that's going to lead to one of those two outcomes. Okay, and Paul wants them to know this. So this is, again, the imperative, and he kind of doubles this up. He tells about, this is your takeaway, right? Know this, that if you're distracted, if you're allowing yourself to become distracted by these idols, and it's interesting here how Paul identifies greed as a form of idolatry. And of course, fornication or any kind of, there's tons of things, as we've talked many times about idols and idolatry here at Image Church. There are many things that become idols because they become a substitute. They're whatever you grasp hold of to satisfy that void in your life. Whatever you're grabbing to fill that void, that's your idol. Because you're looking at something or someone or, other than God to fill that, okay? And it's important to get Paul's tone here. Paul's not necessarily beating up on the fornicator or the greedy person, but he is giving a diagnosis of them. These are people who don't know the love of God. Because if they knew the love of God, they wouldn't have to look to these idols, okay? But going back to beloved children, those of us who know God's love have this inheritance in store for us, okay? Where, again, Paul doesn't use kingdom language very much. It's another kind of area where Paul's quite different from at least the synoptic gospels, the first three gospels. The central theme of Jesus' teaching is the kingdom. Paul doesn't talk so much about the kingdom, but every once in a while he will use kingdom language. And when Paul does use kingdom language, it's usually, at least I find, pay attention why he's using that kind of language, because he would recognize that kingdom is not just a future reality, but it is a present reality. It's something we begin to inherit right now as we feel that embrace of God. And again, this is what I want each of you this week to, in your devotion times this week, what I want you to really concentrate on is feeling God's embrace in your life. We all need to feel, I'm a grown man and I'm a parent, but I need that hug of God, right? I need to feel that embrace of God, because sometimes life is hard, and sometimes you just are unsure, right? So we all feel that, and we can kind of feel that void. There's always, we're not done the walk yet. We're still on that journey, and all of us, we never want to, don't think you stand or you may fall, right? So we don't want to have. All of us need that embrace of God. And this is something we really need to seek for and fast and pray for, so that we can have an abundance flowing out of us, so that we can truly imitate the Father. Let's close in prayer. Father, I thank you for this audience here today. And in this audience, just so many different people are represented. People who are, even today, they're struggling. Even today, they're feeling maybe an emptiness and a void. And they realize it's just so easy to become distracted by the idols of this age and to not look to you as their source and strength. I just pray that each one of us would, again, we would just seek that warm embrace of your love, which is so transformative and which is always there. It's never a question that the gift isn't there. It's just the question of whether we will receive it, whether we will take that gift that you offer to us. But I just pray that anyone who's feeling a spirit of reluctance today, where they just don't feel either worthy enough to grasp your gift, or they just don't feel joyful enough to want to take that gift, I just pray that you would your spirit would break down that resistance in their lives, and they would just raise their hands and just surrender themselves to you. And as they raise their hands and open their hands, they're doing it as a gesture to receive everything that you have to offer. We thank you for your love and goodness. And I just pray that you would be with each person throughout this week and just show them your blessing and your love. In Jesus' name, amen.